And as you just heard, that is the king of rock and roll, the one, the only Elvis Presley, and Jailhouse Rock, one of his great rockin' tunes from the king of rock and roll. And as you know, on this date, Elvis Presley passed away. And it is our honor to have Derek Shelmerdine here for you. He is a great author of rock and roll books, and he has his own podcast. He's got all kinds of cool things happening. And Derek, I want to welcome you to the show.
Hi, Sam. Great to be back. Great to talk to you. And what a topic. What a man, Elvis Presley.
Yeah, and they called him the king, and they did so for a reason. There's only a couple of people or bands that are out there that people resonate to. The Beatles, Elvis, just to name a couple, the Motown groups. And if you talk to groups of today, who influenced you? Elvis Presley,
Yeah,
the Beatles, the Motown sound, gospel. And that's why we call Elvis the king, because he is the one who seems to resonate the most North American wise, while the Beatles, of course, were on your side of the pond, in the UK, and they kind of, when they came over, they ruled for a long time with all their hits and that sort of thing. And so, what do you say we talk about the king for the next hour? And
absolutely.
let's start off at the beginning. You what can you tell me about the king prior to his hitting fame?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he was born on the 8th of January 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi. And interestingly enough, his mother Gladys, father Vernon, when he was 3 years old, his father Vernon went down to prison for 3 years for forging a check, which wasn't a good start for Elvis.
No
But
kidding.
very, very much a church-going family. I mean, Elvis, throughout his childhood, was very regular churchgoer. So gospel music plays a really big part, I think, in Elvis's early life. And he actually made his first public appointment when he was just 10 years old at a talent show at the wonderfully titled Mississippi, Alabama Fair and Dairy Show. And he did a rendition of Old Shep, the Red Foley song. I think he came in fifth, and there's great photographs of him up on the internet of when he was 10 years old, standing with a group of the people who were there. I mean, he bought his first guitar for his, well, let's put it another way. His mother took him to the Tupelo hardware company store to buy him his 11th birthday present. He was served by a guy called Forrest L. Bobo. And he recalls that Elvis actually wanted a 22 caliber rifle, but it's fortunately his mother persuaded him a guitar was probably better. And so he had his first guitar at 10 years old. They relocated to Memphis around 1948. And he was actually working before he left school at a place called Precision Tools. But when they discovered he was underage, they fired him, as it were. And he graduated in 53 and then worked as a truck driver for the Crown Electric Company. So, very much a typical working class background, I think, the very early days.
Now, was the Presley family, were they religious? Because I know that Elvis, he really loved gospel music and
Absolutely.
that sort of thing. But were they, as a rule, were they religious, or was it just something he discovered on his own?
No, I think very much they went to church as a family. I mean, they weren't zealots or anything, but I think they were very much a religious family. And, the regular church going, I think, is what gave Elvis a taste for the gospel music, which, really did play an important part in the early part of his life.
Now,
But he
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, he got his first real taste, if you like, of the rock and roll world on the 4th of January 50, sorry, on the 18th of July 53, when he went to see Sam Phillips for the first time at the Memphis recording service. This is before Sam Phillips had actually kicked off his Sun Records label. And interesting, you know, if he recorded My Happiness famously, it cost him $3.98. And that apparently sold at auction in 2015 for $30,000.
Geez, not
So
bad for a $3.98 investment.
it's not bad. And Marian Keisker, who sometimes did the recordings, and there is a school of thought that she actually was at the desk that day. She asked Elvis who he sounded like, and Elvis famously replied, "I don't sound like nobody," but he said it more in an Elvis voice than I did. So, you know, the guy's always had a sense of humor. And then he was back for his second private visit in the January, about 6 months later. He recorded another couple of songs.
Was it there that he recorded the single for his mom?
Well, that's the story of the first recording when he did My Happiness.
That was
It's
for his
often
mom, right?
well, that's what's often reported. But his mother's birthday was about 3 months earlier. So if it was a bit belated. So it's one of those stories that may have developed in later times. I think what I also read about these is that Elvis went there hoping that somebody would recognize him as a singer and discover him, as it were. But the second time he went, Sam Phillips did really like him, and he said that if ever I come up with a song I think's good for you, I'll call you in again. And that's exactly what happened. He found one, and Elvis went back into the studio in the July of 54. And they tried, it was called Without You, I think, that particular track. That was going nowhere. This is with Scotty and Bill Black,
Yep.
upright bass player, Scotty Moore, guitarist. And that really wasn't working. So they tried lots of gospel type songs, R&B type songs. And Elvis started to ad lib with That's All Right. And he was doing it very much to a rhythm and blues style. And Sam Phillips really liked it and told them to carry on. And he recorded it. And some people put that basically as the birth of rockabilly, when you know, country music met R&B, as it were.
Now, you mentioned rockabilly. Now, would you consider rockabilly a predecessor to rock and roll? Because or were the doo-wops happening at that time?
Well, the doo-wop, rock and roll really grew out of doo-wop and R&B, because that had really been going for, throughout the 40s and early 50s. A lot of the soul artists started off as doo-wop. The Temptations, as the Primes, the Elgins, Four Tops they'd released 4 songs before they got to Motown, 4 singles. Marvin Gaye was with the Moonglows before he got to Motown. So I think rockabilly developed alongside rock and roll. I think rockabilly, it was a specific genre. Sometimes they had a drummer, sometimes they didn't. And sometimes they used vocals that were sort of hiccups and shouts, as it were, a little bit out of the sort of blues area. So I think rockabilly was, I mean, people like Carl Perkins are often referred to the early stuff as rockabilly. So I think there's a very subtle difference. I think with a lot of these things, it's like, when does R&B become soul music? You know, I think there's a very fine dividing line between these genres at the time. And I think rock and roll just developed further on. I mean, what happened with the rock and roll was the drummer really became a very important component. The backbeat, the 2 and the 4, became very important in terms of driving the song, and the bass guitar as well. It's quickly the electric bass came in, and it was very, very melodic, very much a driving rhythm, I think, rock and roll. But
So
Elvis couldn't nearly have been a gospel singer, because he had a tryout at the time that he recorded That's All Right, on the 5th of July. He actually had an audition for a gospel group called the Songfellows, who were based in Memphis. And he failed that particular audition because they felt that he was a great lead singer, but he wasn't too good at harmonizing. He was more of a one-man band, as it were.
He doesn't play well with others.
Yeah, and it's interesting to speculate that had that audition gone well, because that was within weeks of him really starting down the rock and roll route with That's All Right. If he hadn't started on that, he might well have then become a gospel singer, because gospel was his first love. There's no two ways about that.
Now, at this point in Elvis's life and career and beginning of his career, he was with Sam Phillips and Sun Records, and they did
Yeah.
the initial recordings, that sort of thing. When did the Colonel come in, and who else was in that little realm at that time, and how did that form?
Well, that's interesting because again, around the time he went into Sun Studios for That's All Right, and Scotty Moore, Bill Black backed him on that, and then they backed him on all 5 of the Sun singles, and they actually have label credits on the Sun singles: Elvis, Scotty, and Bill, which I thought was good. But within a week or so of Elvis getting involved in that, on the 12th of July, he signed a management contract with Scotty Moore. And it was an actual management contract. Scotty Moore was Elvis's first manager, and then a guy called Bob Neal comes onto the scene. I mean, he was quite a big wheel in Memphis at the time. He had radio show. He was a promoter, one of the major promoters in the area. He had a record shop, so it was going well for him. And Bob Neal offered his help to Scotty Moore and said, can I help you manage this guy? And Scotty Moore was a guitarist. He wasn't really a manager, and so he said yes. So Bob Neal actually then became Elvis's technically second manager, but first real manager, as it were. It was Bob Neal that really got Elvis probably onto the Louisiana Hayride, and at that time Elvis really developed his career in the southern states across to Texas, basically, and he was very involved in that. He signed a deal. Bob Neal signed his management deal at the end of December '54, and Colonel Parker came on the scene shortly after that when he saw Elvis at the Louisiana Hayride. So it's really by the turn of 1955, Elvis's career is really starting to move.
Now, there's famous video that I keep seeing of him performing at what looks like a state fair or something like that. Is that the Louisiana Hayride?
Oh, there is a lot of footage at the Hayride, but he did an awful lot of those kind of outdoor gigs. You see quite a lot of those where he's on a stage. It looks very much as though it could be a fair, because I mean he was out and about a lot there. Well, what's interesting as well is just before he went on the Hayride, he went on the Grand Ole Opry, and the Grand Ole Opry audience really didn't like him. Yeah, the 2nd of October '54, he went on the Grand Ole Opry, and the Opry's manager Jim Denny had a word with him afterwards and said he should give up singing and stick to truck driving. Fortunately for us, he didn't. And it was only a month later he went on the Hayride, and they really liked him. He was too rock and roll for the Opry audience, but what you would think would be a similar audience, because the Hayride was the Opry's biggest competitor, if you like, as radio shows go. But he ended up being one of their biggest stars on the Hayride. He was with them for probably a year, 18 months after that. And then he failed another audition. Colonel Parker is now really starting to steer Elvis's career. And in the March of '55, he was secured him a place on the Arthur Godfrey Talent Scouts in New York. And that was a big deal at the time. But Elvis wasn't successful. Interestingly enough, the Jordanaires were later when they auditioned on there. But that really marks the point where the Colonel was starting to take control of Elvis's career. What happened was Bob Neal didn't have the money to send him off to New York. So the Colonel financed it on the agreement that, if any work comes out of this, I'll get more and more involved in it. So what happened, and none of this was in the Tom Hanks movie, was very much that Bob Neal was very much the manager. He was technically Elvis's manager until after he signed to RCA after the release of Heartbreak Hotel. But the Colonel slowly but surely took control. He signed a special agreement, as it was called, with Hank Snow Attractions, which was the Colonel and Hank Snow organization. And it wasn't really until the beginning of 1956 that Bob Neal decided that he'd bow out. And he basically told Elvis, because he was now in an advisory capacity. He used to go out with Elvis and act as his tour manager, basically. And in the February of 56, Bob Neal effectively bowed out. And the Colonel signed, the formal contract, as it were, but really moving forward on the 26th of March, 56. So, that's actually after Heartbreak Hotel.
Yeah. So at this point, Elvis is starting to become famous, but not an overnight sensation. He's doing it the standard way. He's building and building and building and building and building, and getting his support group around him. But I understood that the Colonel wasn't really out for Elvis. He was out for the Colonel. So he kind of structured the contract that way. Is that accurate?
It's an interesting one. I mean, yes, he did take a very big cut of what Elvis made. But on the other hand, I think he guided Elvis's career quite dramatically. He was very astute. I mean, the guy really knew how to make money, as it were. And throughout Elvis's career, he guided Elvis. I mean, without jumping ahead, because there's a lot of other stuff to look at.
Yeah, exactly. We have a lot to unpackage.
You could say that Elvis managed to move from. I mean, he was the king of rock and roll. 1950s in the 1950s, went into the army. And then, just to stay with the Colonel slightly while we're talking about him, when he came out of the army, Elvis was having hit records that a couple of years away hadn't done him any harm at all. And then you mentioned the Beatles earlier, of course. I mean, they came on the scene in the UK in the October of '62 with their first.
I was going to say, yeah, they came along later.
Oh, they were much later. And they're big. Elvis's big rise to fame was 1956, and that's the sort of next thing we can get into. The Beatles' big rise to fame was 1963, and by the end of at the beginning of 1963, they'd had a small hit in the UK. By the end of 1963, they were on the verge of international success. What had happened was Ed Sullivan, in about the October, November, he was passing through Heathrow, and he saw the Beatles return from, I think it was a Swedish tour, and hundreds of screaming girls, and he thought, oh, this is interesting, I better get this guy on the show. And then a couple of months later, of course, he did. The whole British invasion thing took off, and the Beatles became, well, to say international stars is an understatement. And I think where the Colonel is undervalued by some people is that basically the careers of most of the American singers and bands of the 1950s and very early 1960s, they pretty much came to a shuddering halt in 1964 when the British invasion arrived. And it was the British bands that were getting all the airplay. I mean, some American bands even changed their name to sound more British. A band called the Jet Set changed their name to the Beefeaters. Can't get much more British than that. No success. They changed their name again about 64 to the Birds, and were pretty succungssuccessful.
And everything turned.
Exactly.
You'll pardon the label in there.
Yeah, it was around about 1964. The Colonel, whether he saw the writing on the wall, I mean, he only released songs from the movies. So if you wanted, and Elvis wasn't touring, so if you wanted to see Elvis, you had to go to the movies. If you wanted to hear Elvis, you had to buy the songs, mostly from the movies in the first half of the 1960s. And I think what it did then, it really protected. Elvis was not in competition with the British invasion. Elvis was not in competition with the Beatles. He was just in a sort of parallel universe. And then when rock music arrived, 65, 66, he was still running through the movies till the end of the 60s. So he wasn't in competition with Jimi Hendrix or the Doors. So I think it's interesting to speculate on what might have been if another manager had been managing Elvis and he'd taken a different route.
Yeah, because basically Elvis was kind of an entity on his own because he was basically a white Southerner singing black gospel music in a rock and roll beat. But that,
Absolutely.
and so like he was pretty much on an island. So he was either going to make it or fail based on that. And then if he, succeeded, which he did,
Yeah.
others would follow. But he basically formed that type of music. And where did the explosion begin? And how did it take place?
Well, it's interesting to see how it was more of a slow burn than an explosion. If you look at 1956, he'd signed 1956. He'd signed to RCA in the November of 55 for $35,000, $5,000 for himself. And then he started to get TV appearances. First one on the Dorsey Brothers show in the January of 56. And then in the July, he famously sang Hound Dog to a Hound Dog on the Steve Allen show.
Yeah,
But
I've
where
seen
the
that
story
video.
starts for Elvis, yes. Where the story really starts, I think, for Elvis is with Heartbreak Hotel, his first single for RCA, released in the November. It wasn't actually a hit in America till the March of 56. And if you imagine now, this is essentially his first real national released single. He spent 8 weeks at number one. He was number 3 on the R&B chart. And on the country chart, he was number 1 for 17 weeks with Heartbreak Hotel. I mean, he had 4 other hits on the country Billboard Top 40 before that. So again, like he was very nearly a gospel singer, he was very, very nearly a country artist as well. And Scotty Moore, Bill Black, DJ Fontana had joined them by now. And it was very much the song that took them into the stratosphere, and written by Tommy Durden and Mayborn Axton, Hoyt Axton's mother. The inspiration apparently was a newspaper article that said, "Do you know this man?" The particular guy, they wanted to identify a guy who killed himself, and he left a note simply saying, quotes, "I walk a lonely street." And it was that really from there that he really started to move. It was after that, as I say, that he signed with Colonel Parker. He went to Vegas in 56 as well, to the New Frontier Hotel. They billed him as the atomic powered singer, which was great. Although, the audience wasn't rock and roll and he didn't go down well. So it's another 10 years before, well, not quite 10 years, it's a long time. It's 10 years, yeah, before he goes back. First called the king of rock and roll by a journalist called Robert Johnson, believe it or not, at the Press Scimitar in Memphis. And he wrote an article about Elvis and called him the fledgling king of rock and roll. And that apparently is the first reference to that. Then in the September, see, it's really starting to build now.
Right.
In the September, he was on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, 60 million viewers. So, it really is starting to move. And then the November, he had his first movie, Love Me Tender, originally going to be called the Reno Brothers, but they could see the fame he was attracting. So they changed the name from Reno Brothers to Love Me Tender.
Right.
The $1 Million Quartet, not that it's really part of the Elvis story, but that was the end of 56 as well, with Carl Perkins, he was in Sun Studios to record Matchbox. Jerry Lee Lewis had recently joined the studio and was basically with him as a session pianist. Elvis dropped by, Carl Perkins dropped by. You know, they did a jam, and the rest, as they say, is history on that.
Now, one of the things that always wondered is I saw videos of his appearances on TV. Was it true that they told him to tone down because of his gyrations and that were affecting young girls in a way that parents didn't find appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. That was his third visit to the Ed Sullivan Show, his third and last visit, and they only showed him from the camera angle was just from the waist up, for that very reason. That was in the
Now,
January of '57. So you can see, you know, by the end, well, just to finish the '56 Rise to Fame, in the December, the 29th of December Billboard Hot 100, he had 10 singles in the Hot 100. Ironically, he wasn't at number one. He was kept off number one by Guy Mitchell with Singing the Blues. It was a number one for the fourth week. But apart from that, he had 10 singles on the Hot 100. Amazing feat. From nowhere, basically, at the beginning of the year.
so basically he went from who is this guy to the king of rock and roll within a short, less than a year period.
Yeah, absolutely. You could argue very much over the 9 months from March when Heartbreak Hotel hit the charts.
Wow,
Excuse me.
that's
Yeah,
crazy. Now
end of the year.
we're getting close to the end of the first segment here, and just want to remind you that we are talking about the king of rock and roll and the anniversary of his passing today. And we are going to continue on in a few minutes. But we're going to continue for the moment. And I just want to find out, once he started to have the hits and that sort of thing, is that when the controversy started on how he performed?
Um, No, I think he'd always been seen as something of an anti-establishment sort of character because, you know, if you look at you mentioned earlier, you know, the early '50s stuff or mid '50s when he's performing to crowds and crowds of screaming girls. And I think it was virtually the beginning of the new, well, the rock and roll, really. And it was very much. Um, it was a time of real change. I mean, arguably the '50s was when the teenagers started. It was the '60s when the teenager became a full-on marketplace in its own right, as it were. But it was a time when people were very much not doing what their parents had done. The previous generation, they were very similar to their previous generation, sort of grandparents, as it were. I can remember seeing pictures of my family, my parents and his parents on the beach. And they were all there the guys were there in three-piece suits. And I think it was very much Elvis was at the fore of changing that and creating this whole new teenage marketplace that the '60s really picked up on.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to play another song from the King. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to play another one of his early hits, Hound Dog. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the movie part of his career and
Absolutely.
the songs that came out from that. You are watching a special edition of A Chat With, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to part two of A Chat With, a special edition. And we are talking about the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. As you just heard after the break, that was Hound Dog. And we have with me Derek Shelmerdine. Derek is a author of a great book, which is over his left shoulder. You can see it there in the upper corner. And we'll talk about how to get the book at the end of the interview, because I think it's a great book and you should have a copy of it. And in the meantime, we left off. Elvis has exploded. He's doing well. He's gone into the army. Now let's talk a little bit about when he first comes back out. Now, it's been a couple of years. How did the fans react when he came out from his stint in the army? And what is your take on the fact that he felt that he should be treated like everybody else and not treated like an entertainer and be in the army to entertain?
Yeah, very much. He saw himself in the army as another squaddy, basically. And I thought that spoke well of him. And I think his record company, RCA, and the Colonel did a good job of managing that 2 years or so that he was away, in terms of releasing just enough records to keep the interest. And his popularity was it was very much still there when he came back. I mean, he left the army in the early March of 1960, and within a couple of weeks of being back in America, 21st of March, he was in the studio recording a bunch of songs, one of which was his new single, or his next single, Stuck on You. Interesting to see that Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana, the drummer and guitarist, are still with him, and the Jordanaires worked with him throughout most of the 60s.
Now, he comes out of the army, and I see a change in the way he is handling himself and the way he is performing. He seems to not be as gritty, I guess is the word I'm looking for, as he was. Was that deliberate?
Well, it's certainly very much his career changing. I mean, Elvis had three very distinct careers: 1950s King of Rock and Roll, 1960s Matinee Idol, and 1970s Ultimate Cabaret Act. And the whole movie thing is really starting to take off when he comes out of the army. He released four movies before going in the army, the last one being King Creole, and they allowed him a few weeks to finish it before they inducted him. And then in sort of 1960, 61, GI Blues, of course, as you'd imagine, is the first movie after, and his sixth movie, Flaming Star. And then the whole 60s thing about the records coming from the movies, you can see it starting with a seventh movie, Wild in the Country, in 61, a couple of hits on that, Lonely Man and Wild in the Country. And Blue Hawaii, also 61, Can't Help Falling in Love, Rockahula Baby. And what's interesting about 61, it was his last concert for 7 or 8 years on the 25th of March, 61, Pearl Harbor. And his next actual live performance wasn't until 68, that TV special. And his next concert wasn't until he kicked off Vegas in the July of 69. So you can see that his career was really starting to change. 62, the Beatles hadn't yet to have any impact in America. So, they were not the reason for this change. But the whole music scene was changing really dramatically after the end of the golden age of rock and roll at the end of the 1950s. And you can see it in what's happening to Elvis across that very early part. Because 62 is really when the movies and the records really start to be almost all the records from the movies.
Now, one of the things that I wonder, and it's because I'm in North America, so I wouldn't know, but with your being in the UK, maybe you were aware of it, or maybe you know of it. Elvis, I would assume, exploded in the UK. Now, when we get to 1962 and the Beatles are starting to make their rise, how did it affect the Elvis's popularity there?
He remained popular across the 60s, I think, because he wasn't in competition with the Beatles. I mentioned earlier the Colonel's idea or strategy that if you want to see him, you go to the movies. If you want to hear him, you buy the songs from the movies. And that was very much by 62, 63, that was very much what was going on. And Elvis remained, I think, very popular. He had hits across the 60s. Well, he had hits from the 50s through well beyond after he he died. So he's never gone. He never went away, as it were. And I think the fact that they handled him being away for a couple of years sensibly and not try to flood the market with music, leave them wanting more kind of
Yeah,
strategy.
yeah.
Often a good one, and it worked.
Now, the music from the movies, you listed off a few of the songs from a couple of the movies. They had a different feel than his earlier hits. Was that because he was trying to make the songs more family friendly as opposed to for quote the kids?
That's right. I mean, you had odd exceptions, like his 11th movie, Girls, Girls, Girls in '62. The hit from that was Return to Sender, which was very much a return to form, as it were. But it was shortly after that, really, about his 12th movie, happened at World's Fair. All the movies then until Spin Out, his 22nd movie in '66, virtually all the releases were either directly from the movies or had been recorded back in the '50s and early '60s, which was interesting. And I think you're right. Basically, a bit like Cliff Richard in the UK,
Right.
he moved from rock and roll into becoming, and Tommy Steele, the UK's first king of rock and roll, as it were. They both became family entertainers, and in a similar kind of way, that's what Elvis became, because he wasn't competing with the Mersey beat groups. He wasn't competing with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the Animals, and I think he's just got a completely different sound in the 1960s. It was songs from the movies, basically.
So would you say that his second part of his career, the movie aspect of it, was as successful as his first part of his career?
I think the answer is yes, but it was different.
Right.
Um, I think that his music was very different, really, across the three. I mean, the '50s was very much rock and roll. The '60s was very much, as you say, sort of family orientated, by and large, movie type songs. And then the '70s, he very much became the cabaret entertainer. Very much the big band behind him, the very fast drumming,
The
and the
jumpsuits.
performance. Oh, jumpsuits. He became I mean, he's always been a performer. I think that's one of the things that really marked Elvis out. You mentioned earlier footage of him from the middle '50s, his very early career, when he was on stage and very much performing to the crowd. I mean, that just got, I wouldn't say exaggerated, but that just took on a whole new persona by the time we get
Right.
to Vegas, entering to Also Sprach Zarathustra, Richard Strauss. Um, it was just so full on, so full blown. And I think the movies were interesting. I mean, the last one was in '69, Change of Habit, his 31st movie, if you don't count the concert movies. I mean, it was making two or three a year, and they were all good box office, right across the '60s, some better than others. But I think he was pretty much in the top 100 box office movies in every one of them.
Was he cool? Was he okay with doing all those movies? Like, was it what he wanted to do, or did he feel he was better as a stage performer?
I think the answer is yes and no. I think if you go back to Jailhouse Rock and particularly King Creole, which I think he thought was his favorite film, um, he was heading off in an acting kind of direction. He was a big fan of James Dean, and he liked to think of himself sort of Brando Dean kind of acting. And as much as he loved acting, I think he enjoyed singing that bit more. I saw this quote that says, that the thing he most enjoys in all the world is performing in front of a live audience. But I think he was getting a bit bored with the movies. By the time we get to the second half of the '60s, the plots were pretty similar. Elvis chasing young lady, older lady chasing Elvis.
Yeah.
Um, and
Elvis chasing girl, girl not interested, but really interested, but not interested.
absolutely. Round the corner a couple of times and then
Yeah.
into the finale. Um, and he made two, sometimes I think a couple of years he made, well, you can see 31 movies. He was making two or three a year of very similar movies. So I think it's fair to say he was getting a little bit bored, which is why I think the timing was perfect, really. I mean, the NBC comeback special in the December of '68, which his first live performance for 7 or 8 years. That really brought him back to what he wanted to do, and that was before the movies ended. They ended in the end of '69 with Change of Habit,
Yeah, and the comeback special was
Mary Tyler Moore.
68.
Yeah, yeah. So you could see it very much starting to change, and it changed before that actually. If you look at the hits he was having. Up until about Spin Out, it was pretty much all movies. And then In the Ghetto came out in '69. A complete change of direction. That gave him a number three because most of the movie ones were, they were top 40, very few were top 10. So he was hitting the charts, but not in a big way, but he just continued to. And then after The Trouble with Girls, Suspicious Minds, towards the end of '69, gave him his first number one for quite a while. So you could see '69 was very much, I mean, he made a couple of films in '69, but it was very much the end of the
It was
movie
the transitional period,
era.
would you say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, if you look at songs like In the Ghetto and Suspicious Minds, real concert favorites in the Vegas years.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Vegas years because I want to talk about a different thing about Elvis afterwards.
Hmm.
But he got into what we call now residencies,
Yeah,
and everybody and their brother does the residencies. The Eagles are doing a residency. Reba McEntire does a one. Um, Celine Dion does one, and, and on and on and on. But back when he started going to Vegas, he wasn't was he doing residencies, would you say, or would you just say that he was doing frequent shows there?
no, it was very much residencies. In fact, I was reading somewhere that Elvis changed the whole course of the music scene on the Vegas hotel circuit. Previously, basically, they'd had people in to entertain while people were eating their dinner, kind of thing. But again, this is all down to the Colonel. I mean, the Colonel was a genius at merchandising. I mean, way back in the '50s, he almost invented pop music, rock and roll merchandising, and the whole thing about the way Elvis's residencies were really a blueprint for the music that was to follow. No longer were they there just as an add-on to the restaurant or the lounge. They really were theaters, basically. You were going there to see the artist. You weren't going there to have a chat with your mates and a nice meal and a little bit of background music. So I think Elvis was one of the forerunners, if not the beginning of a change of what the music scene was like in Las Vegas hotels.
Now, one of the things that I always find fascinating is in Colonel Parker's ideas of merchandising. He had ways of making extra money. Like one of the ideas that I heard about was there were Elvis, I Love Elvis pins that were out,
That's
and he
right.
also just had I Hate Elvis
Absolutely.
pins as well. So he was making money on both ends
He
of the
made money out of.
spectrum. So he was basically a genius with some of the things that he came up with.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's very famous there, making money out of people who love Elvis and then making money out of people who don't. I mean, you don't get much merchandising doing that. So, I mean, he was a very important part of Elvis's career. And what's forgotten is he took 50% of, well, very little bit, but he took a very large percentage of Elvis's taking. But he also negotiated very high payments for Elvis. Elvis was one of the highest paid. I did read one year he was the highest paid actor in Hollywood. More than the likes of Sinatra. and certainly the amount of money he was being paid for Vegas was very high. And I think Elvis would like to have toured because he loved performing, but the Colonel was reluctant. There are various reasons why. Some believe that he didn't have a passport, and he was actually there illegally. I wouldn't like to get too far down that particular route,
Right.
but uh, what I think one of the ways that the Colonel sold it, Vegas to Elvis, he said, "Well, let the world come to you." And that's exactly what happened. And if bear in mind that in the 1960s, people made their money on the LPs and the singles to a lesser extent, and the tours themselves were loss makers to promote the current single, to promote the current LP. So not only did you not have the cost of hoteling, a whole dance band and road crew and two or three, four articulated lorries and stuff to transport yourself around the continent or the world. Basically, once you'd actually set up, apart from taking your drumsticks and your guitar back off the stage when you leave, it was pretty much done. So he made a lot of money out of touring, as well as a lot of money out of the records.
And that's the thing about Elvis. I don't really see a whole lot of information on him touring as a
Mm.
whole. So basically, that plan kind of worked, that the world came to him as opposed to him going to the world.
Yeah,
And because I can remember him doing a few shows in Canada and that sort of thing, but I don't recall it like the Beatles, where the Beatles came and they crossed America and that sort of thing. Did Elvis get across to your side of the pond very often?
not at all. Famously, he never played outside North America, as far as I know. Interestingly enough, the last gigs he played outside of the USA were in Canada. He did three shows in latter half of 1957. And I must just give you a quote from Vancouver was the last time he ever played outside of America on the 31st of August. And about 20,000 fans. So that would have been pretty big for the time, because this is the time before the Shea Stadium gigs and stadium gigs and the like. It was the Empire Stadium in
Yeah, the football stadium.
Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a stage rush shortly after he came on, and the show was stopped. They managed to get the people to sit down again. And no long, soon as he started, there was a second stage rush, and the show was stopped. I mean, basically, and he played about 20 minutes, if that, I think. But the music critic for the Vancouver province, Ida Halpern, reinforces exactly what you were saying earlier about the whole generational thing and what the parents thought of the kids who liked Elvis. And I quote what she said in her review of the concert was, "An artificial and unhealthy exploitation of the enthusiasm of youth's body and mind. One could call it subsidized sex."
Wow.
That was 1957. I've never seen a review quite like it.
And especially when we see the stuff we see today, where it's just like, really, that's what it was. And getting on to what I was mentioning before we did the bit about Vegas, a group that was very important to him were the Jordanaires.
That's right.
They were very, very important. Tell me how they came in to be with Elvis, and their, other than backup singers, they were basically a great great group on their own. How did they come about, and how important were they to the sound of Elvis?
Oh, I think they were crucial to the sound of Elvis. They really were, and they worked with him effectively across his whole career, across the rock and roll, the movies, and the and not so much in Vegas. Um, but he met them actually before he signed to RCA. He famously, I can't remember exactly where it was, probably about his third Sun single. They came to Memphis and he went backstage and met them. And he said to them, "Someday when I'm famous, you guys are going to be my backing singers." And they thought, yeah, yeah, that'd be great. And the RCA deal came up. They were the backing singers on that. And they continued to be the backing singers on most of his stuff for a very long time to come. But I mean, they were a very important gospel group in their own right.
Exactly.
And they appeared on, I forget how many different artists it was, but they were background singers on an awful lot of stuff, as well as the material they're working on with Elvis. So they are literally on thousands of singles, and well, probably thousands of hit singles. If you look at it at a sort of Billboard Hot 100 level.
Now you touched on the fact that the Jordanaires were very good gospel singers.
Hmm.
Elvis got into gospel there for a while, a gospel feel with a lot of his music. Uh, what what brought him to that point of his career, and how did that come about?
Well, that really the start of his career. He was going to church from, as soon as he could walk, basically, from a very, very early age. He was singing in choirs that would be singing naturally in a church, and it was very much his first real introduction to singing and performing, if you use the word in its most general sense. And his first hits of his five Sun singles, four of those, so 10 sides, five singles, four of those were actually Billboard Top 40 country hits. So he was being very successful long before he became, the king of rock and roll, as it were.
So he did a lot of beautiful songs, "Crying in the Chapel,"
Yeah,
and the one we're going to play at the end of the show, "Peace in the Valley,"
yeah.
and just to name a couple. Um, were those just to, I don't want to say appease? Were they there just to show his range? And by range, I don't mean vocal range. I mean range of style. Or was there another reason behind those songs?
No, he recorded gospel because he loved gospel music. He's got a gospel album. And the Jordanaires, of course, recorded Peace in the Valley before he did. I mean, that particular song goes back to 1947, The Flying Clouds of Detroit. And the Jordanaires recorded it in 1950. Of course, Elvis had a minor hit with it in 57, gave him a number 25. It was released in America on an EP. But no, it wasn't a sop to anyone or anywhere. I mean, Elvis loved gospel music, and in fact, when the movies, most of the music was coming from the movies. The only effective new material that wasn't, recorded before he went in the army was actually gospel music. So, it has a special place, I think, in Elvis's repertoire.
And Elvis, he shows his versatility. He can have fun with a song. He can be serious with a song. He could be romantic with a song. He could be sad with a song. He can make the listener feel so much. What do you attribute to that? Because like he could do that with almost any song.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at footage of his Vegas, or if you were lucky enough to have been at a Vegas concert, but if you watch him performing in Vegas, the guy has got a unique sense of humor. He sends himself up. The famous line, without any, standing there without any hair. Um, and it, the, the performance is unbelievable. The whole scarves to the ladies in the audience, and the way he brings he can take serious songs and introduce an element of humor without humiliating the song, as it were. I think is a tribute to Elvis's talent. And you mentioned the vocal range. I mean, he has quite a pretty good vocal range. And in fact, there is famously, very shortly before he died, he did his what became his last tour. CBS filmed a couple of those concerts, only about half a dozen, I think, 10 maybe. And they filmed two in their entirety. And that was going to be a TV special. But it never did become a special, but it's easy to find up on the internet to see the whole concert. And I've watched it. And yes, he was a little bit overweight by that time, but his voice was outstanding. And his performance was outstanding. The reception he was getting from the sold out concerts were exactly the same as had been, 5 years earlier. And, he was still giving the scarves out, and the ladies were absolutely loving it. And it's really interesting to watch right at the very, very end of his career. He was still there.
Now we get to the point where the reason we're having this show, he passes away.
Yeah.
And the outpouring of emotion that came from his fans, that has to be testament to what he meant to not only his fans, but to rock and roll in general, with the way things were celebrated, with his passing, the way things were honored, and that sort of thing. What is your take on that, and what do you think was the reason behind it?
Well, I think that actually for me there are only two people in that ultimate league, Elvis and the Beatles. Lots of really good people as well, but I think I would only put those two people in that particular league. And I think it's a testament to Elvis that, I mean, he wrote out the 1960s, which is arguably the biggest change in popular music ever, before or since. And he was as popular, if not more popular, in the 70s than he was in the 50s. You look at the audiences in the Vegas concerts, the 70s. You had children there with all generations following. He appealed to everybody, and I think part of it, I think, was the fact that because you only got to see him in the 60s in movies, and because he spent the 70s on stage, basically, albeit in Las Vegas. He had a very high profile. Everybody knew who he was. Pretty much everybody liked him to a lesser or greater extent. You can't not like Elvis. You might think, arguably, you could argue he's overrated. I would never argue that in a million years. But Elvis is not someone I think you could actually dislike. I mean, some people in the pop world, you could see that they could be liked, they're Marmite, and they can be disliked, but not Elvis. And just one quick one on the death of Elvis. I was reading one of the theories that Elvis is still alive. Is that some handwriting experts took a look at his death certificate, and the signature on the note that he sent to President Nixon. We haven't actually mentioned that, but he met Nixon, gave him a gun as a souvenir, and became a federal drug enforcement agent,
Yeah.
basically. But the argument is that he signed his own death certificate. And if you look at those two signatures on the letter to Nixon and the death certificate, handwriting experts have claimed that they are the same person. Now, I wouldn't like to go down that road, but I just think it's interesting. There's always a conspiracy theory for everywhere, and that's the one with Elvis.
And somehow I have a feeling if we ever find Bigfoot, we're going to find Elvis,
Absolutely.
because it's probably him wandering the woods.
Probably,
But
quite probably.
that is a great look at the King of Rock and Roll, and he resonates as much today as he did back then,
Absolutely.
with generation after generation after generation. And I want to thank you for taking some time for me to talk about the King of Rock and Roll. But before we go, let's talk about your book.
Oh,
very quickly. We have the interview that we just played a couple weeks ago, talking about the book. One more time, just very briefly, tell us about it and how we can get it.
right. It's called Rock'n'Roll Unravelled, and it tells a story of rock and roll, basically popular music from its roots, Robert Johnson blues, through to mid-60s, mid-70s, late 70s punk. And it's a dip in, dip out kind of a book. It's not start the beginning, read to the end. And it's available on Amazon and from my
And
website. That's the
and
one.
as you can see, that's the book right there. I don't know if it's seen on the screen right now, but that
It's
is the
perfect.
book. And you can pick it up where?
Oh, you can pick it up on Amazon. In the UK, you can order it in any bookshop. You can actually order it from get a signed copy from my website. That's rock'n'rollunravelled.com.
And with that, we're going to play one more Elvis song to take us home. And why don't you do me a favor and tell me a little bit about the song, and then we will play it.
Yeah, I gave Elvis a hit in 1957. It actually goes back to 1947 and the Flying Clouds of Detroit. They recorded in 47, the Jordanaires recorded in 50, and the singing cowboy, Roy Rogers, he actually recorded it in 1952. I mean, an awful lot of other people have recorded it, but I think it's a wonderful example of Elvis in gospel mood. I really do.
And with that, I want to thank you for tuning in. And this has been a very special edition of A Chat With my guest, Derek Shelmerdine. And we will be back in just a few moments with some more great programming. Lori Lace and Squeezebox coming up next. You're listening to A Chat With, and this is KPHR.